Mergers, acquisitions, and compound transfers can often result in complex TMS file transitions that require seamless management of people, processes, and technology. In today's episode of The State of TMF, I'm joined by two TMF gurus, Steph Viscomi of iSide and Dawn Niccum of Inception. Together, we'll explore some of the key frameworks to help ease these transitions and how they can be used to navigate these challenging situations effectively. The State of TMF is officially in session. Let's get into it.
So when it comes to these unique situations, these major organizational events, they can have a pretty consequential impact on TMF teams and TMF processes. So today we want to cover everything to do with how to build the right process and plan to be able to deal with these types of situations properly. We have three scenarios. Scenario one is that your company acquires another company. So what do you do from a TMF perspective when that happens? Scenario two is when your company merges with another company. Also an interesting situation to deal with. And then scenario number three might be when you acquire a compound or a device from another organization where there are some legacy TMFs that you need to get a handle of. So those are the three scenarios that we're going to tackle today. But before we jump into that, just like we always tackle when it comes to TMF presentations, really focusing on people, processes, and technology. Steph, Dawn, from your perspective, why is this so important at this point?
Well, people, process, and technology is really the core of everything we do, but certainly the core of any kind of acquisition or merger. When you're acquiring new TMFs, so we have to have these three intertwined to work together. I think it's very important that that is at the end of the day, the main focus.
Dawn, any
Yeah,
thoughts?
yeah, just to add to that, it's really the flow between all three of these, isn't it? It's, ensuring that you're not forgetting about the people along the way. You're not forgetting you're going to have different processes, people coming from different organizations or TMFs done completely different from what you're used to. And the technology, we can't forget about the technology because it can be all over the place. And we'll talk about that a little bit later.
Amazing. So obviously what we want to do is stitch these three components into everything that we discussed today. So as we go through these different scenarios, we'll try and pull in on, whether this is a focus on people, processes, or technology. So let's jump into the first few scenarios. So when we were preparing today's discussion and we had some initial conversations between Steph, Dawn, and I, we were thinking, about when an organization acquires another or when an organization merges with another, there's a lot of similarities between the way that you would prepare for that specific event or once that event occurs. So we decided to actually combine these two scenarios together. But as we go through some of the frameworks that we've defined for today's discussion, we'll also try and highlight where there might be slight differences, whether you're merging with an organization or whether there's an acquisition happening. So let's jump into that. So when it comes to a company that is being acquired or that you're acquiring another organization, Steph, what do you think are some of the key TMF considerations when that event happens?
When that event happens, if you're acquiring a company, you want to understand with where the TMFs are in general at that other company. What's active, what's closed, where is it all sitting, what system it's in. Is it maybe how different is it than your current system? Of course, the people, if we're acquiring, are those people becoming part of, will you have interactions with them? Are we able to talk with them? Becoming part of your team. And I think another piece is also processes is a really key importance. How different are those processes across the board when you're with what they were doing? And then at the end of the day, we need to figure out what those processes were, what the systems were, and we have to put it all in a plan. And I know we'll talk more about getting into those plans later on, but having that game plan and moving forward and giving us some traction to figure out what does our ultimate end game look like.
Amazing. So really focusing there, I guess, on sort of understanding that current state of affairs, like you mentioned. So what are we walking into here as we start to
Yeah.
acquire this organization? you know, and then I guess also thinking a little bit about, are there active studies with this organization? What's the environment for closed studies? Those types of things, right, Steph?
Right, that is absolutely correct. And one thing I'd like to know also is, um, I really like the note on here where we talk about minimizing disruption on active studies. That is a really big situation. I've worked with acquisitions before where you have an old study team or the new study team getting put in place, and people just needing to know where everything stands. But as a TMF expert or the TMF person or team, we really want to know that things are moving forward actively, and that it's not going to really bother any of the work that's actually happening as we're if it's an active study. Very
Alright.
simple. It needs to be very simple and smooth.
So now when we change our lens a little bit, there's definitely some similarities between when an acquisition is happening, when a merger is happening. Dawn, what do you think are some of the key TMF considerations, and what might be different when you think about a merger?
So one thing I want to mention between acquisitions and mergers, because I'm a QA person, I'm always thinking about regulatory compliance. So we want to make sure that we're maintaining the data integrity between whether we're transferring between systems, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but also particularly during active studies, that you're ensuring you're not losing any of that in the minutia of all this. When it comes to mergers, I think, one of the biggest differences that we talked about is that in an acquisition, the acquiring company is not necessarily the partner company. I think, the acquiring company often may be being acquired because they have a great compound to acquire. From a senior management standpoint, they're not always thinking about down to the level of the TMF. In fact, most of the time they're not. When you're talking about mergers, there is more of a dance that you're doing. You're looking at whose system you might choose. You're looking at whose process you might choose. You're having those discussions on a higher level, knowing that your stakeholders both really do have a lot of influence in which way you're going to go. You want to be as efficient as possible in all of these, but making sure you stay compliant. And you do plan for the smooth transition, but it's usually pretty bumpy. There is going to be things where people love their system and they've used it forever, whatever forever might be, and they don't want to go to the other person's system. They feel like they're giving up something. So, always thinking about, again, bringing it back to the people, always thinking about those feelings, because you have to address those in order to have a successful outcome at the end. And our successful outcome is, of course, that inspection ready TMF.
All right. So now that we've set the scene, and thank you, Steph and Dawn, for taking us through kind of some of those initial key considerations. What I'd love to do now is start to talk about what we've called the THO framework, the TMF Harmonization and Optimization framework, which is developed specifically for when your organization is going through one of those types of events, whether it be a merger or an acquisition. So what we've done is developed a series of steps that you might want to consider as you go through this process, and we'll highlight at various stages where there might be differences in approach, or what you might want to consider differently in either scenario. So now, if we think about pre-merger or pre-acquisition, in both cases, we're going to want to take a look under the TMF hood, right, Dawn? Like, why is this step important as part of this framework?
Well, it becomes important because we know, especially either acquisitions or mergers, it can happen. Acquisitions probably more often, where a TMF may have not been maintained in a validated system. We do see people using things like Box, SharePoint, other just shared drive places to keep their TMF content. And we need to know, is there any risk of bringing those documents over when they come into presumably our validated system. So we want to know where they used it and where all those documents are. So it's a good idea. It gives us a baseline and it helps us understand what other things we're going to have to consider before we're even able to migrate that TMF.
Right. And what are some of the things that we might want to look for, Steph, when we're performing some of that due diligence on existing systems and process, that kind of first look under the hood?
I mean, it's really important to see just opening up the original TMF. Don really talked about having a compliance system. Number one is important. I had a situation in the past where when we started to do this due diligence efforts and we recognized the company that we were acquiring, not at my current organization, but in the past, where they had put all the documentation in a non-compliant, non-validated system because they were being acquired. And at the same point in time, it was a little bit of like, oh, I kind of maybe wish you just left everything where it was, because now we have another challenge of how we're going to migrate out of there. Key processes are really important to start looking at as well. What was done beforehand? So all these little activities that may seem like doing the due diligence, I can just do it as we go. Well, actually, no, let's do it all up front. So you really have all of your marbles in your bucket, right? So you know what you're dealing with and how you're going to do it and the stakeholders that you need to involve in either one, getting this done or making the decisions along the way. And getting to that really endpoint that we want of having remaining compliant TMFs, active TMFs if they're active, and as well as just really all of our, we're checking all the check boxes as we're supposed to.
So I guess a message to anybody being acquired or merging with another organization, just keep those TMFs where they are for now.
Definitely, please.
I guess also, Dawn, the reason that Steph mentions there, moving something, that your company is getting acquired. So you think, oh my God, I've got to sweep up here and I've got to do this there. Is it sometimes better just to say, okay, we leave it here because maybe there's data there, there's metadata, there's information that's going to help us maybe tell the story? Is that kind of why we think Steph's making that recommendation?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely that. Especially if you export from your validated TMF into a non-validated space, did you get everything when you did that export? So one of the mistakes that can be made is, well, we got all the documents, but we didn't get all the information about the metadata. So again, when it comes to down the line, because ultimately we want our TMFs to be inspection ready. We say that all the time, right? How do we ensure everything is there? If we're losing metadata about our documents, about our artifacts by putting it in a non-validated state, potentially. Whereas if you leave it where it is, then we can go and interrogate that existing system and understand what's there and really guide what should be pulled, how it's going to be pulled in if we're wherever we're going to put it in our TMF system going forward.
Right.
Well, if you don't mind me just adding on to that, one piece also to really take consideration, now we're breaking audit trails. If there were audit trails in place beforehand, so you don't have originality of where that document started, where everything started, and it goes back with the metadata and all of that. So it's not just, as Don said, the documents themselves, it's all of the pieces behind it. And we have to be able to speak to that upcoming in an inspection or whatnot, if this is something that would head towards inspection. So certainly, keeping things where they are is really important if that's a consideration.
Right.
But yeah, need to look at the back part of everything as well, behind the scenes.
All right, perfect. So we start with sort of a high level, quick peek under the hood. We're doing a little bit of initial due diligence just to understand what we're walking into, right?
Right.
Now we go from, the merger has occurred, the acquisition has occurred. Now we're in harmonization mode. Now we got to mobilize the troops, get everybody kind of moving towards the same objective. where do we want to start there, Dawn? What's the first place that you would kind of start once that acquisition's happened?
It's really what's said here, a TMF gap assessment. So, the due diligence, as you pointed out, it's a high level. I have an idea of what I'm going to find. Now I want to do a little deeper dive into the TMF and say what's there, what's not there. What am I missing? How was this done? What am I looking for? And those are all really, really important things to start us going. Sorry, a little cough there. So, you're going to spend time looking through actual artifacts. You're going to spend time looking through actual TMF documents, not doing a full end to end. You're going to risk basis, but really getting that idea of is this complete? Is there what I need in it? Or what else am I going to need to do for remediation? And it really starts leading into the rest of this because now I can start thinking about processes. Who do I need to be part of this? Who are my stakeholders? The TMF is going to guide you on that. Like it's going to help you start putting your team together and start thinking about what's next. So often when I write up a gap assessment, I'll write the good, bad, and the ugly in the assessment, but I also have a recommendation. These are the things that you need to consider doing in order to get our TMF to an inspection ready state.
Right. So we jump in, we start doing a sort of TMF gap assessment. I would imagine that gap assessment is going to probably evolve a little bit over the first few months as we start to get deeper and deeper into it. Then we're going to start to look at comparing existing processes, right? And I
Yes.
think what's interesting here, Steph, I'd love to hear your perspective on the differences between a merger and an acquisition when it comes to comparing those processes, because the objective might be slightly different, right? Between an acquisition or a merger when it comes to processes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's two different ones. So comparing processes, we've done our gap assessment, we figured out our baseline, right? We know where everything stands. And now we're up to the point of if we're in a acquisition, well, we're acquiring the company. So the difference there is they're going to be taking on our own processes. We're not going to take on theirs because that company is now probably no longer, most likely, they're now part of company ABC. So now we have to merge them into our, excuse me, put them into, I use that word merger real quick, put them into our processes. So now getting them up to speed, how are we transitioning them into them, meaning the TMF people, their TMF processes into our own? So there's needs some type of planning. There is a lot of change management, which I believe we'll be talking about at some point throughout this as well, that is required in part of that. But I think the other part of as well is what did they do beforehand? We need to understand what processes, what oversight was in place, because maybe we're a bigger company and we've acquired a very small company, and the processes that they had, sure, they fit at that time for them, but they don't fit into this new scope here, but they're very tied to those processes. So now we have to make sure, what did they do? How did they do it? How was it documented? So we can show that later on and put that over. Now, as a merger, we're going to sit down with our fellow stakeholders. It could be on either sides of the house, who's part of our team, to determine, okay, if we're merging companies, what is the best process? Is it a very detailed, or is it more of a high level risk based? Who knows what kind of process we're looking at? But where do we want to go from today in determining which is the best processes that we're going to utilize? And again, somebody's going to be changing, so there's still going to be change management involved as well. So that's just along the lines of, and we'll talk about systems as well, but there's a very big difference about transitioning from one company to another, but also deciding which processes are the best, comparing those two and deciding which is the best for the organization moving forward.
And I guess you might find yourself in a situation where the company that you're acquiring, your organization is acquiring, maybe there's things that they've been able to achieve, develop, create as part of their process that you might want to adopt, right? Maybe that was even part of
Yes.
the reason behind acquiring the organization or merging with the organization. So I guess that's also an important thing to consider, is as you're doing that kind of gap assessment, but also comparing existing processes, kind of building a map of those things to identify how in each of the different areas, archiving, operations, management, monitoring, whatever it might be, how is the organization managing these things today? And how do we, do we feel like that part of the process might be a level up from where we're at today?
Yeah, I mean, it's all the dynamics of any company, a merger or acquisition is changing. If you're acquiring a company, you're gaining probably new compounds, new studies, whatnot, but it's more depending on what you decide to do. If you're acquiring that company, are you maintaining their TMF until the studies are out and you're still using your own? Who knows what that looks like, but there's definitely, you need to move forward and compare and just know that it's not a one fit for all. If your current processes may not fit the other ones, just may need to realign with what you're saying, Oliver, of looking at theirs, and maybe we can utilize and bring to, revise as we need into what we have today.
And then I want to kind of pick out something that you mentioned there, Steph, which I think is really important, which is, what is the impact, or how do we minimize the impact on active studies? Dawn, I know that you've been through this a ton of times. What are we thinking about in that situation where we're acquiring a company or merging with an existing company and there is active studies that are going on?
Right. Yeah. And I actually want to pick up on a point from Steph just for a second ago when we're talking about existing studies maybe staying within existing process. So, one of the things we want to absolutely minimize the impact on the ongoing study, not to push timelines, not to impact any of the data integrity and so forth that's going on. Super, super critical. I mean, that's maintaining the regulatory compliance. But it's also, we may be in a situation where we have parallel processes. And, so from a documentation standpoint and also from a regulatory standpoint, we really need to clearly delineate what studies are following what processes. And you really want to have that well documented. In fact, there's an artifact in the TMF that you can put that under with your list of SOPs. But it's also, might be something we're going to talk, we're going to touch on storyboards a little bit later, but it might be something, if you're keeping a storyboard of what's going on, which I do recommend you do, just keep a listing of all the things you've done, not necessarily to put in the TMF, but more as your back documentation to, ensure you can speak to things. That's where you put all the good, bad, and ugly. Why didn't we roll up to our process? Because there may be some very different things. Something as simple as, I might have in my process for a small company, we do periodic review every quarter, but the larger company, they do it, biannually, because, that's their minimum. So if I'm keeping with usually you can do more and it's okay. But if someone happens to pick up that process and look at it with a newer study with that same compound and is under the new processes, what does that look like? So that parallel running two processes, it's again, it's all a dance. It's all maintaining a state of control while you're doing two different, slightly different things, but sort of the same at the same time.
And I think what's really interesting about that, because I think when you think about, if you're on a team that's being acquired, you're not being acquired, but let's say your organization is being acquired, or you're on a team that is acquiring, the most important thing to think about there is, we don't want to rock the boat. Even if the company that's acquiring you has a vastly better system or a much larger team, maybe you can work out how you can leverage that team. But if you're in the middle of a study, changing systems, major overhauls of processes, it's going to throw potentially things into a tailspin, right? And then it's very, very
Absolutely.
difficult for you to be able to demonstrate that you've had the proper control that you needed and the consistency throughout the course of the study. I think that's a really, really great recommendation. So Let's move on a little bit. So we've looked at the gap assessment, we've compared existing processes. We talked a little bit about people as part of our people, processes, and technology. When we have two organizations that are going to be working together more closely, we need to have an understanding of who the key people are, right, Steph? When it comes to that, what are you typically looking at, in terms of understanding who is involved?
Well, I mean, from my point of view, I like to look at the whole landscape. Um, if we're acquiring, is there another group? Is that group staying? Are they coming into our group? If we're merging, are we having two different groups? I've seen in the past where a company acquires another one, and the old one will still maintain their current processes, but they have to report up to the other company that's acquired them. And how does that work? And rolling that all up to the top. So really finding out who your stakeholders are, and who are your decision makers, and who are the folks that are going to be working throughout this process to ensure that we're maintaining things like data integrity, getting our migrations done, making these all these little things along the way. I hate to say doing the checkbox, but there's an element of checking the boxes of going through this process. And it's very easy, as we can, for those that can see this slide, if you're able to see it, there's a lot of dots and a lot of little steps along the way. And this is not a one fit for all. It definitely is modified for active, closed, big, small, whatever your study is, or whatever your situation is, but you want to include all of those key people. And I think one thing that could be often forgot, to me in my mind, is always have our quality folks involved. I think it's really important. Shout out to Don, I guess. If you're migrating, if you're talking about systems, bring them in for those initial conversations. It's really important that they're on the same page. If you have a company or that has a different systems department that may be part of your TMF and needs some involvement there, because there's some elements of that needs to be reviewed.
Right.
And then, of course, your leadership and making sure everybody's aligned and know that the plan that you're putting together moving forward is good to go, and the timelines and whatnot. So really establishing your key team of people and the stakeholders that are going to be part of it. And again, I can't stress this enough. I talked about a little bit earlier is the change management, but even more importantly, communication. Just make sure you're continuously keeping everybody in the loop throughout this whole entire this first piece of this process, right? The pre-merger, getting ready, getting prepared, looking under the hood and verbalizing what you're finding. But now the harmonization piece, getting those people involved and actively communicating, collaborating, and just keeping them up to snuff on what is going on. So it's really important to identify those key people within your areas.
And actually, I just want to add a little piece to that, in that there's definitely the key people, but we also have to not forget about the little people. So everyone, whether they may not be actively involved in the actual, comparing of processes or the transition or that sort of thing, they're certainly impacted by it. And we can't forget about those people. So every study team member,
Yes. Yeah.
everyone, we didn't, one of the functions we didn't mention, I think you said systems, but even our IT, making sure your IT team is involved. You might need your regulatory team involved. Anyone, everyone and anyone who would have contributed, could have contributed, might contribute in the future to the TMF. All of those functions. Doesn't mean that they all have to sit around the table for all of this, but they need to know what's going on. And particularly, you want to be communicating out to them, which we're going to talk about plans. A communication plan is one of the important ones. We're going to want to be communicating out to them. These are the timelines. This is when your study will be impacted, or this is when your compound will be, however you're setting this up. This is when it's going to happen, at least what we think now. So people are not blindsided
Right.
when it suddenly comes to them and they're like, well, wait a minute, I thought we were staying in the old system.
Or they weren't planning for it at that point in their studies either. They have other things going on, and this will completely, again, talking about disruption, be a disruption to their studies of what's going on. Yes, I can't agree more, Don. Thank you for adding that in.
And for those of you that are trying to figure out how to build that kind of stakeholder mapping exercise, we have some templates that we've developed as part of this presentation that we'll share with you afterwards. And in fact, most of the plans that we'll talk about, we've developed some high level templates for you guys to take away and use today. So, you know, we've gone through the gap assessment, we've compared the processes, we've started thinking about who needs to sit at opposite ends of the table, the different groups and their responsibilities. We started to talk about communication as one of the plans. When we think about this, you know, moving from harmonization, we've really looked at all of the different things under the hood. Now we've got to think about what we need to do. How do we, you know, plan for whatever we've identified? Dawn, when you think about the types of plans that you would want to create as part of this, what are some of those things that you would look to?
Yeah, at least, and you can call them lots of different things. It can be one big plan versus a lot of little ones. But, I want to see a plan around transition, and that might be a big overarching one. I want to see in that plan and in that transition plan, I want to see what processes are we going to use? Who are our, key team members for the transition team? So that's not going to be all your stakeholders, but it's going to be the key team members. So we're going to have that, a communication plan. You may have a migration plan, particularly if you're migrating from one system to another. We want that. You want to make sure you have that detail of how did I maintain data integrity from system to system. Very, very, very key things to have in there. You may have, you may even have plans, that are specific to study team documents. You may have specific data management versus regulatory versus site facing documents. So you may break some of those things down. And I'm sure I forgot a couple of the plans in here, but again, we need an overall, what are we going to do? When are we going to do it? How are we going to do it? Why are we doing it? And then again, the how, the 4 W's and an H needs to be captured in that plan so that we ensure we're able to have a roadmap of how to get from A to Z. Did I miss any plans, Steph?
No, you didn't, but I just want to make a comment. I mean, John said it in a roundabout way, but we're going right back to the core. People, process, and technology are the three main components of that transition plan. And I've been through this multiple times myself, and it's so valuable to have that to reference back to for your own as you're going through the process. Share with others, your internal stakeholders, and maybe down the line when you actually have to speak to what you did. And I think a key part of it too is making sure you are talking about those in your transition plan, kind of maybe a little historical piece of it, what it looked like in the past. I found that very valuable. The summary of where things stood, maybe some of the processes, maybe it could be what types of oversight was done, or where some of the documentation that could be referenced in there. So really utilizing, as Don talked about, that transition plan almost as your like central hub, and that could point to different directions, but you all have everything in place to go forward.
All right. Amazing. Thank you for that. So let's jump into the integration phase. So now that we've got everything, we've got all our ducks in a row, we've got all of our plans kind of ready to rock and approved. Now we've got to start thinking about how we integrate all of this and actually execute on these plans. So Dawn, where are we starting here? And why is the first step so important as we start to integrate our plans?
Yeah, and we have process as a first step because you don't want to jump into this without having defined what is my process going to be? What process am I going towards? And what I have seen as a mistake is when you forget that, there's just chaos. We want to control, this is chaotic. All of this is chaotic. We want to control that chaos as much as we can. So by having, this is what our process is going to be.
Yeah.
We know how we're going to integrate. We know what system we're going to use. Excuse me, and who's going to be involved. Then it should smooth it along the lines quite a bit.
Yeah. I mean, I think Don and I were chatting earlier today, and I made the comment of organized chaos. And it's kind of true, right? Yes, there's a lot of moving pieces, but it can very flow nicely. And just as Don was saying, is knowing what's coming up before you even start this whole transition, such as getting your processes in place, is such a key element, because now your brains and everybody's thinking ahead of like, okay, we know what the process should look like. Now we have to get the rest to align to all of that.
I think what's also interesting about that term organized chaos is that if we go back to the people part, when you're thinking about who's going to be involved in assisting and supporting the implementation of these plans, you've also got to think about who is going to be able to thrive in that organized chaos,
That's
because
right.
not everybody will, right? Sometimes the chaos can consume you,
Yeah.
and it can stifle you. And so having people that kind of can float in that environment and stay level-headed and cool-headed, I think is important to be able to manage this from start to finish. So when you're thinking about the people, of course you need to map, the different stakeholders, making sure that you've got TMF team versus TMF team kind of working together. But you've also got to think about who are the right people to kind of spearhead some of these initiatives that are going to be able to keep a level head throughout the process.
One thing I want to note, as much as we have this really pretty kind of lay of the land right here, anything can pop up at any time, right? I have been part of an organizations before where we've acquired old companies, and oh, we were told we have, just a handful of active studies, and then finding out, oh, wow, behind the scenes, there's actually like 100 plus closed studies that we had no idea, and we had to put that into place. And I think when you create, going back to the people piece, a very important piece, that core team just keeps it moving forward and stays on track with it. Those are very key. That's a very key piece to this entire thing, just like you said. People who are level headed and can handle keep the chaos organized, it's just make a tremendous difference.
And I want to add just one more piece of this. You may lose people along the way, and probably you will, because there are going to be people, especially if you've ever been part of an acquisition or merger. There's
Yep.
a lot of nervousness that has nothing to do with trial master file that's going on, that they wonder what's going to become of me. And if an opportunity pops up, they hop ship. So, you have to, as much as you can, plan for there's going to be some loss of people along the way, and you're going to lose some knowledge along the way. So
Yep.
as much as you can to capture people when they're available, capture them when you have them, and capture what's in their heads when you have them is the best way to think of it, because you just never know what attrition is going to happen with this, and it generally does.
Yep.
So let's jump. What we're going to do now is we're going to speed through the last few points in this process, because we've got a whole bunch of other things to talk about. So Dawn, do you want to just run us through very quickly, very briefly, what are some of the other last few steps in integration, and then move us into optimization?
Sure. So we're absolutely, doing the actual migration of the TMFs, training people. So regardless of if you're going into your existing system, you're going to have a lot of people that need training, that need to know what process they're following. And then finally, communicate.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this has been like the trending comment throughout this, right? Is, can't communicate enough, but, make sure your staff is trained, and it's not just the one and done, because sometimes when we implement some of these things, it's a quick, okay, we're going to give you this training session about these are our new processes, these are our new systems, and here's how the new system works. Well, you just want to make sure that you go back, check in, maybe do another, follow up, having those open office hours. Change is huge, change is challenging. Not many people really love change. And just like Dawn says, tempers are a little raised as it is already. Some people maybe on their way out the door, or maybe nervous if their position will still be there, or heck, maybe they're just in the middle of a really crazy active study that they may not be 100% in tune to what's going on. So making sure you're training accordingly, communicating on a regular basis, but not overwhelmingly enough. not overwhelmingly where they're no longer listening. So I think those are really important things. Dawn, do we have you back?
You do.
Okay.
All right. And then I guess the last piece when it comes to we've integrated and executed on our plan, but our job is not done there, right, Dawn? We've got to think about what do we do after, 6 months, after a year? What are
Absolutely.
some of the things you might be looking at?
Well, again, and this is putting my QA hat on a little bit as well, is that, our work is never done. We always have ways to continuously improve, and we need to look at that. So, as we get farther along, we may again look back to, in an acquisition, they may have had a really great process. Can we implement that into our process? Some of what they've done. Can we, as we've gone along and we've done all this integration, we've been doing this all along, we might find something that we were doing that, why are we doing this? Or, oh no, we forgot, a step here or two. It's really the opportunity to make sure that we continuously improve. And that is from a regulator standpoint. And I know we'll talk about that, regulator expectations. That's one thing regulators, particularly EMA, MHRA, FDA, even to an extent, especially if they have issues, if they see issues, they're looking at, okay, you may have not done great here, or this may have not gone really well. How are you going to make sure that doesn't happen again? What
Right.
are you doing for continuous improvement? So it's part of this is a quality system thing. It's part of your overall quality system to just ensure that you're continually improving what you're doing, because we always should be getting a little better. Nobody's perfect.
Yeah.
And
And
even if you think you're perfect, things change and then you're not
that's very
perfect.
true. Right. To just tag on to that, one more thing that I've done in the past, and I think it's really a really fruitful activity to do, is revisit your gap assessment that you did in the beginning.
Yep.
Look at it. Look at your transition plan that you finalized. So revisit your gap. Maybe do a risk-based QC or some kind of QC against that to do just a sampling check. Did we fulfill what we were supposed to build? Do we feel in a much better state than when we were then? Did we close out everything? And then, of course, like I said, looking at your transition plan, did we check all the boxes? Did we complete what we said we were going to complete? And I think this might potentially lead us into some storyboard conversations. The one thing I do want to add about that as we go into that is, when you create your storyboards, create them at the time you're doing them. I've been in the position of having to create storyboards years after an acquisition happened and trying to pull dates out of the blue or things that happened. It can be so challenging because, just as Don said earlier today, people leave, turnover happens, the world keeps going on, and we do lose some of that knowledge base. So, prepare that stuff in the background as it's happening and it's very fresh in your mind. So I know sometimes that's the last thing we want to be doing, but I've actually, for me, taken the habit of keeping storyboards, create them in the background for my own reference and knowledge, and being able to work on them throughout as needed.
All right. All right, let's move forward through to the third and last scenario, which is when your company acquires another compound or a device. So let's jump into the second framework of today's discussion, which is the TTO framework, the TMF transfer and continuity, really helping organizations build a structured plan and process for when you acquire another compound or device. So what are we doing first here, Steph, when it comes to acquiring a compound from another organization? As a TMF leader, you've been notified that this is happening. What are some of the first few steps that you're going to look at?
I want to find out where all that TMF content is, just like I would anywhere else. And again, this goes back to the comment I made. You might be told where we have 5, 10, whatever active studies, could be more, whatever. But then all of a sudden in the background, there's a lot more, and it might be in different locations. So I think that's the first and foremost piece, is identifying where all of your TMF content sits. So, and where and how and getting access to it, of course, is very, very important. but start getting your mind around what's that game plan going to be on how we're going to be now putting that into your organization.
All right. And then I guess we've got to ask ourselves the question whether the TMFs that we're going to be looking at are also part of a submission, right, Dawn? Why would we want to be asking ourselves that question pre-transfer?
Well, again, it's a risk-based approach. If this is a compound that maybe they've tried on, or a device they've used on many, many different indications, and the likelihood that that TMF from X, Y, and Z study is not going to be inspected, I don't want to spend my time on that. And it's really focusing on what matters and taking that as a risk-based approach. So if it's not going to be part of a submission, or maybe we're acquiring multiple compounds and one of them is going to sit on our shelf as well, perhaps, it's going to be one that we're not going to spend a lot of time. We may just bring that TMF in, archive it, and call it good. It doesn't mean that it won't come back to us later, but let's not worry about that one now. Often you acquire a compound, and I have a couple of examples of this from clients over recent years. They acquire a compound and they want to submit within a year, because they're acquiring it. They looked at the data, the study data looks good. It was a positive study. And for whatever reason, the company that had the compound decided not to take it forward. And there's lots of reasons for that. Well, suddenly you're going to take it forward, at least, and there may be 15 TMFs, but 10 of them are phase 1, 5 of them are for another indication, and there's maybe 2 or 3 criticals. These are my pivotal studies. Those are the trial master files highest at risk for being inspected. So let's take our time and efforts and focus there. And then the rest of it, let's just find a safe archival place for it, safe, validated archival place for it, and not really worry about it. And it just helps you focus.
All right, perfect. So once we've gone through the pre-transfer phase, we've made the kind of an understanding of what all of the different sources of content, we've understanding if maybe these TMFs could support a submission in the future. Now we're jumping into the actual transfer of TMF content, or a series of TMFs. Steph, could you quickly walk us through the 5 or so steps here in the transfer, and kind of why those steps are in that sequence?
I think these are pretty similar to some of the other slides we've shown, and probably similar to other TMF activities. But of course, again, establish your baseline, do the TMF gap assessment. Where does it stand prior to coming into your system, if it's going into your system? Most likely it is. Right. So establish your gap assessment, get that done, have that in your back pocket, and start working from that. From there, you want to create your plans, your transition plan, migration plan, all the plans we talked about. And one thing we didn't talk about earlier is, don't forget, at the long run, depending on how this is happening, you might want to consider the TMF plans having a transition game plan as well. If they're going from, if you're acquiring them and they're going to a new company, maybe it's that company's template, making sure you're establishing your TMF plan transition as well. So putting your plans in place. The next one is determine system transfers, determining the system, which is a key one, and then the transfer requirements. Which system is best for the organization? Maybe the company, maybe the other company had a great system and we've acquired that, we're some reason keeping in them, or we're keeping it, we're putting it into ours, or whatever ones that we might utilize. And then what does those requirements look like? So we're saying compliance and keeping data integrity. And with that comes the infamous activity of mapping. Many of us have done it. It sounds easy, it looks easy, but it's not so easy. You can have indices. I don't know if many of you have seen a slew of different indexes, what they may look like across the board. You have your basic reference model ones, but that can change 6 weeks from Sunday, or maybe there's a homegrown one put in place. So you want to map it to what you have to do. That is quite an activity that I wouldn't just throw shade at it. It is a very big activity that can take a bit of time. So think about that very, take your time with that one as well. And then of course, the big one, more into the piece of migrating our TMFs and going through that entire process, which is a process in itself that has many stakeholders as well. Certainly something I am very, very close contact with currently. So those are the transfer pieces. There's a lot of pieces in between, but this is the high level ones that we thought were important to share.
Yeah, and I love the comment about sort of the lots of different types of indexes, right? I think naturally it's going to be easier if you're looking at a series of different indexes that are aligned to maybe various versions of the reference model.
Right.
But if you have that scenario where you're having a homegrown model, which still happens, surprisingly still happens, it makes it much more difficult, because not only do you need to figure out how you map, you also need to learn that new index.
Yes, absolutely. And I've seen them from being based off of the reference model, but expanded greatly to based off of the reference model, going into something much smaller, and then try to figure out the complexities of where you're putting things, and then getting alignment and agreement. Let's not forget that. That's really important with our stakeholders, making sure everybody's happy on where things are going, because it's not just doing this activity, but it's bringing in the people and getting the correct buy-in, and being able, and the system setup is ready to go for that.
And just
All
one
right.
quick on the mapping, I mean, well, two quick points. One is there is the pre-mapping activities where we're trying to determine how these are going to look at, but then you have to look at it once it gets to the TMF as well, because no matter how good you do the pre-mapping activities, you're going to inevitably have things filed in places you just do the head slap of how did that get there?
Yep.
Like how did that make it there? I have good funny ones I can share with someone offline sometime. Yeah, and then the other the other piece with this is, again, thinking about one of the things in Alcoa, C plus is it has to be retrievable. So that's why the mapping becomes so important. At the end of the day, you need to be able to retrieve these documents should you need whether it's you're going to have ongoing studies, or particularly in an inspection, you need to be able to get the documents, because if you have all the most beautiful TMF in the world, but you can't find documents in the TMF, you're not going to fare well in an inspection.
Right. All right. So if we think about moving from the transfer into the continuity phase, we're starting to now work directly within some of these TMFs within our own environment, perhaps. From here, Dawn, I'm going to give you a minute and a half to give me a run through of what are some of the things that we're going to be doing in this phase. Pressure on.
Pressure on. Got it. Well, we've talked about as much as you can maintain that communication with the transferring company, because ultimately you're going to have questions. Make sure there's someone you can go back to and say, hey, we don't know why this was done this way. We don't know what this document is. Help us out. You have to at some point call the TMF final. You could spend the rest of your life putting these I've had a TMF with 500,000 documents. I could be spending the rest of my career making that a very beautiful TMF. It's not worth it. So take that risk-based approach, say, what is good enough? Remember, quality is the absence of errors that matter, and keep that in mind. But also keep in mind, develop the storyboard. Steph started putting there. So, really, really put all the good, bad, and ugly in those storyboards so you can speak to it and start preparing people for inspection. Because these probably are not going to be pretty TMFs. But if you prepare for it and you're very transparent with your inspectors, and I'll actually hop into the last one there. If you're really transparent with your inspectors from the get-go of this is what we got, this is how we remediated it, and this is what we're ending up in the end, you're much more likely to have a successful inspection where you're able to retrieve what they need to have retrieved, and you're able to explain when you can't. You're able to know, yeah, you're right, that document may not meet Alcoa, but study's over. We can't do anything about it. So, they really say to them next, what are, again, our continuous improvements to try to prevent that in the future? I mean, maybe we didn't do a good enough due diligence way back in the beginning. We're going to put a step in there where someone looks at that. So it'll give you all that. Did I make my minute and a half?
I think you did. I think you did. All right. So we're already talking about inspection. So why don't we talk about the regulators? When these big events happen, and they can be big, they're probably not going to be small. When we think about the types of activities that we're going to be undertaking, the plans that we're going to be creating, the documentation of what we've done, what are you thinking about when it comes to what inspectors are expecting to see, knowing that something like this has happened? Dawn, throw that to you.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to those plans we said. They're going to want to see that you had a plan for this transition. And, I worry less about how beautiful your plan is to how complete it is.
Right.
Did you address all steps? They're going to want to see, did you validate and verify? So, are you ensuring what your system came from? Was it a validated system? And if it wasn't, how am I addressing that? Where is, of course, documentation, documentation, documentation. Because if it wasn't written down, it didn't happen. It's very simple. So you need to show that whole piece of it. And then finally, the migration. We will have that migration plan. A lot of times that can be a very technical document because that might be your IT documents and how they map things and how they did different loader systems or whatever they might have done. With that, how did we ensure our data integrity from system to system? And that's really the key. And they want to see our documentation of that. Show us how you feel A equals B.
And I'd like to tag on here. One thing I said earlier to do was, or that I feel like is a great activity, is to go back 6 months, a year down the road and revisit your gap assessment and revisit your transition plan, making sure that you have everything all in order I guess in a pretty little package in some ways. So when you do this, you're preparing yourself, you're doing inspection readiness activities. So when you walk into that inspection room, you'll be like, you know what? I've double checked this. This is actually all good to go. And I know right where things sit. And the other point that I think is really important to show at inspections is not only did we figure out the past history, did we figure out the migration, the transition, everything about this, but what are we doing moving forward? And showing that we have everything is now set in the right process and moving forward as needed, and alignment within the processes that we stated in the beginning or in the transition plan that we all agreed and aligned on. That's where everything is now. So, showing those continuous improvements and having that oversight. And again, as Don said, the documentation is so key. We can speak for days, and I'm sure if you guys don't know Don and I, you don't know Don and I, we can speak for days. But backing that up, it have to have the documentation behind you to show them that it's been done, it's been agreed upon, it's done per plan. And if it wasn't, be ready to speak to that as well. And it's okay. It's okay. Just transparency is key.
All right.
And one of the things pre-inspection you can do as well, do an internal audit or do a mock inspection. Those are things, and you might not call it a mock, you might call it an internal audit. Theoretically, inspectors aren't going to ask for your audit reports. But even if they do, if you show you followed your quality system, even if it showed some deficits, people feel like they're opening up their dirty laundry. I actually would argue against that. You're actually showing that you did a deep dive into this and things aren't perfect, but you've also seen some plans you can put in place to have continuous improvement. So, there's been times I've shared internal audit reports with an inspector and actually had findings downgraded for it. So it can work.
All right. We are at time, but I will spend a minute or so just giving an overview of some of the really great templates that have been prepared that talk a little bit about that pretty little package, Steph, that you just mentioned, some of the things that you're going to want to do to be able to get those things in place. So If you guys want to get access to any of these templates that have been developed, head over to Montreal's LinkedIn company page. Go give us a follow. On Friday, we're going to be releasing these for free, available to anybody that wants them. So go over there now. So you're already there, ready to rock for Friday. So we've got a TMF transition plan, your TMF gap assessment checklist, TMF process comparison and selection matrix. So how do you evaluate between an acquiring company and an acquired company, what the selected process will be moving forward? Stakeholder mapping, understanding who is sitting at other side of the table, and then finally some tools around communication planning. So lots of really great resources available to everybody for free if you just head over to Montreal's LinkedIn company page. And that brings us to the end of today's session. Steph, Dawn, I knew this would be fun. I also knew that we would get to the hour. Not surprised. But it's been a really great conversation. I'm super happy that we went through these this information and the frameworks that we put together. Thank you both for joining us. I would love to have you guys back. I know that there's a ton of things that we could talk about. But today, thank you so much.
We've had a fantastic discussion today about managing TMF transitions using tried and tested frameworks. These frameworks can be applied in various scenarios, including acquisitions, mergers, and compound or device transfers. We hope you found this episode valuable and gained practical insights to help you in your TMF management journey. Thank you for joining us on the State of TMF. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more episodes to help you stay ahead in the world of TMF. Until next time.